I just somehow was more one of the girls than one of the boys. The church has been both fine and not fine. I had great support when I was outed. The bishop was wonderful. He'd always said to me, if you're ever outed, I will stand right by you because I'm backing you, because I do not see this as a kind of problem. And he was as good as his word. The thing about God being non-binary, it's a couple of points. One is, just because we are sexed and gendered doesn't mean that God is. I think one of our problems with God is that the Bible tells us that God made us in God's image. But what human beings do is we flip that round and we make God in our own image.
Welcome to Outcast, the podcast where we hear coming out stories from famous faces and brilliant LGBTQ plus people working hard behind the scenes, from all backgrounds and from all corners of the globe. On this podcast, we discover life stories, and in doing so, we dissect some of the most pressing issues faced by the LGBTQ plus community today. We hope we can support and inspire you, our listeners, whether you're part of the LGBTQ plus community, out or not, or an ally listening to learn more. I'm Rosie Pentreath, your host, and I've shared my coming out story in writing and on various panels, and I know firsthand the value of talking through my experiences. Now I'm giving people from all corners of life and from all backgrounds the same opportunity. You may have listened to other episodes before, and if you have, thank you for coming back. Or you may be here for the first time because of our guest. Welcome. You can follow us on social media at OutcastLGBT, and you can find us online at outcastpod.com. Thank you for listening. This week, we're welcoming Sarah Jones to the programme. Sarah is a transgender vicar, public speaker, singer-songwriter and priest in charge at St John the Baptist Church in Cardiff. Born in London, she grew up in the 1960s knowing she was one of the girls but kept it to herself. She got married to a woman but divorced by her mid-20s. She then had gender confirmation surgery in 1991 after, in her words, she squared it with God. She's always been religious, and she was ordained in 2004, becoming the first person to have made a gender change, then ordained in the Church of England. Less than a year later, though, she was outed as transgender in the national press when somebody she knew tipped off a journalist. Sarah's spoken openly about her experience of being trans and being in the church ever since. Sarah, welcome to Outcast.
Thanks.
It's great to have you with us. Start by telling us a little bit about yourself. How do you identify?
For many years, I identified simply as a woman. The trans label was something that I had done and had finished. So it was about the crossing over or establishing the true me in the world. And in the last 2 or 3 years, I've had to pick up the trans label again, simply really because of the kind of pushback that there's been, the anti-trans feeling in some quarters. And at first, I didn't really even want to pick the trans label up, to be frank with you. I've got more used to it now because I think we need to pick it up, or at least I felt I needed to pick it up and say, look, here I am. And so I've now, in my head, I identify as a woman, but on public things, the trans thing comes out a bit more.
Let's go back to the beginning. Where do you tell your coming out story from? Where does your coming out story begin?
Well, I suppose in common with lots of LGBTQIA people, we're always coming out, even to ourselves in a sense, sort of like, here I am as a person in the world. And sometimes you have to realize that you're not the person that everyone automatically assumes you're going to be, or even that you assume you're going to be. I did realize when I went to primary school very early on that although I was classed as a boy, in some way, I just was more one of the girls. That was a big moment in my head, maybe when I was maybe 6 or 7 at the latest, but I never said anything to anyone. I never went home and told my parents. I never made a big fuss about it, and this was in the late 1960s or mid-1960s even, so it's just as well probably that I didn't, because it might have been a happy situation, or I might have been sent off for some aversion therapy or something. Who knows what might have happened. Later on, coming out wise, I made my gender change when I was 28, pretty much forgot about it, and then having been ordained, I was outed in the media. So there's a whole series of coming outs really. But I guess in my mid-20s, I began to realize that this was a massive issue in my life and I had to do something about it. But it probably wasn't till my late 20s that anyone else really knew about it.
For allies that might be listening, or for even LGBTQ plus people who aren't trans themselves, is there a way of describing how you kind of knew you were one of the girls?
Yeah, I mean, at school, really, temperamentally, I just somehow was more one of the girls than one of the boys. I did play in the girls' playground in primary school until an age where it kind of became unacceptable to do so. I don't know what that was, but let's say, the year below the top year or something. So maybe I was 9, maybe I was 10. And every time we'd line up, boys and girls, I'd sort of think, well, okay, I know I'm in this line, but I sort of really should be one of those. And then even just in work life, really, I remember once in my early 20s, I was part of this fantastic troubleshooting team at work. I worked for a national organization, and it was full of macho and really full of self-confident men, and there was me, and every time we got together, these guys would look at me and like they couldn't work it out, because I was actually part of the team and nobody actually disliked me, but it was kind of like, this is weird. What is this about? And I was quite young looking. I've always looked younger than my years. And I used to joke that it was because I was on some sort of supercharged apprenticeship scheme, still doing my A levels. And we got around it that way. But I was definitely an odd appendage to the places I was in.
Fast forwarding to when you were 28 then, what kind of support were you getting from friends and family?
For me, and I think it's true of a lot of trans people, in as much as that often we take a long time to come to the point to say anything to anybody, because who wants to announce that there's something in the world other than what is most obviously the case? I mean, it's a big thing. How do you tell your boss? How do you tell a work colleague? So I found from my maybe mid or early 20s, this was beginning to get a little bit more of an issue, but I didn't feel it would dominate my life. I went to counseling. I told the counselor, let's keep this in the box, please. I don't mind being feminine, but I don't really want to do anything silly. So I'd sort of worked away under the radar at it, but eventually I realized that I kind of needed to explore my femininity. And I bounced around between the gender lines for a bit. I thought I might be a gay guy, and as luck would have it, I met a lovely gay guy, and he phoned me up and invited me on a date, and I had this kind of like, oh, secondary, what the heck do I say here? Well, say yes. Why wouldn't you say yes? Give this a go. Over a period of years, even though the relationship was good in many ways, we slid past each other because I wasn't a gay guy. I got to 28 and I realized though that I had to do something. So I quit my job, sold the house. I had been married and we'd split up very amicably, because she'd said to me, look, I love you and all that, but it feels to me like I'm living with a gay woman, and I've nothing against that, but I'm not one.
Mm.
So we're going to need to split. So we were selling the house anyway. I quit my job. I didn't have any qualifications, no A levels or anything. And so I went back to college essentially. I thought I could go to college, do some A levels, because if I make a gender change, who the heck's going to employ me? I mean, this was the mid to late 1980s, and there wasn't really any trans representation anywhere. I thought I might be unemployable. I thought I might need some good qualifications. So I quit my job. I went to college, did A levels for 2 years, and nobody cares there how scruffy you are or what the hell you're doing. And I basically just grew my hair. So it started really short, and at the end, the people who didn't know me had no idea what I was at all. I mean, they weren't bothered by it, but I mean, I went to the school office once to get a form, and the lovely receptionist said, "Oh, there's a young lady outside, wants so and so form," and someone else sort of stood up and had a gawp at me and came round and said, "That's a guy." And she said, "No, no, it isn't." And they both came and had a look around the screen, and they weren't being nasty, but it was just like nobody knew. I'd get on the bus with my girl classmates and get chatted up by the bus driver, and they couldn't work out what was going on. Only I knew, you know. So anyway, it was a long, 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 long process. And honestly, Rosie, I tried to do everything I possibly could not to make my gender change because I thought it's the biggest of the leaps,
Mm.
and I can only do it if it really is the right place for me. So it took me 9 years, and along the way, I had some good advice and some bad advice, but the best advice when I tumbled down to the doctor said, "I've no idea. I don't know." This was at the beginning of this whole thing, so this was maybe mid-1980s, and he said, "I don't know, but let's work it out together." And I thought that was great advice because if he'd tried to pretend that he was in charge or he was some sort of expert, I could have ended up being shoved anywhere. I was quite religious, so I went to my parish priest, and he was great as well. He said exactly the same thing. He said, "I have no idea about this whatsoever." As it happened, he had a friend who was also a Roman Catholic priest and a clinical psychologist. So he sent me to his friend.
Wow. I love that. I really love this "I don't know, we don't know" sort of
Yeah,
attitude,
yeah,
especially when the second part of that comes in, the kind of the listening. You know, "I'm gonna listen to you. I don't
uh,
actually know, but I'm here to support you and keep listening." It can be the best support that people give.
it is.
Yeah, in our lives, so many people want to give us their advice from their point of view, and it's sometimes not quite the ticket, especially in times like this.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your faith for a minute. So, you were religious pretty much all your life?
My mother was a Roman Catholic. I was a happy Roman Catholic. I went to Roman Catholic school. It gave me a nice kind of grounding in religion. But as long as I can remember, maybe 6 or 7, I would go to church with her every Sunday and would sit right at the front. So I'd have a front row seat. So I saw everything that was going on, and it all made sense. I mean, in an age appropriate way, but it all made sense. And when, the reading was about Jesus doing this or Jesus doing that, I could always kind of just imagine it. So I always pretty much went to church. I stopped going for a while in my late teens, largely because I was a musician and I'd be out on a Saturday night gigging, and I'd get in at about 2 in the morning or 1 or something, and then nobody, would wanna get up for mass, first thing in the morning. So a couple of years I didn't go, but I missed it, and so I went back, and that was great. And then when I was exploring my gender identity, this is gonna sound really lame now. This is like the lamest thing anyone will say to you for a long while. I fell in with an Anglican crowd. I started running with the Anglicans. So I went to church with a few of them, and this guy who invited me on a date, our first weekend away together, we went to church on Sunday morning, and there's just something about the Church of England that I absolutely loved. And so over a course of a few years, I made this kind of commitment to the Church of England and Anglicanism. I just love the way we debate things, and that it isn't top down, and that people can have different positions on women or homosexuality or what does this verse in the Bible mean, or all of these things. I absolutely loved it. I'm a very happy Anglican.
It's good to hear. And in a recent interview with Attitude magazine, you described God as beautifully non-binary. I saw lots of people kind of picked up on that. I think it's a beautiful concept. Um, I don't know if you want to touch on that, but also let's talk about faith and how it directly supported your coming out journey.
Faith in my coming out journey was very important to me because I did at my core believe that God loved me, whatever that means. I mean, when we're talking about God, no words suffice. And when I say God loves me, what do I really mean by that? I mean, even I don't know what I really mean by that. Philosophers have written thousands of pages on it, but I do believe that God actually does love me. And the nights, and there were nights when I sat up in bed crying in the small hours of the morning, wondering if when people knew about me that they would hate me or beat me up or mock me, or if I'd never worked again or whatever. I always held on to the fact that I believed that God loves me. So that was very important. And I also, in these times, would flick through the Bible and just see what was there. And I came across various passages. The Psalms are an obvious place for people in distress. I read a lot of those, and that was really helpful. So I prayed to God. I went on retreat as I was trying to figure out who I was and what I was. And I also had to square the really big question of, if God had made me a guy, did I have any right to change that? Because the truth of it is, if there's a God, and I believe there is, if there's a God, we should live in harmony with God's will. And if I was going to do something that was in direct contravention to that, I'm not sure I could have done it. In the end, two things happened. A very, very, very old priest. He started off by saying to me exactly what the other wise people had said. I don't know. Let me think about it. But on the last day I was in the retreat house, I had a meeting with him, and he said, I don't really know anything about this. He said, but look, it seems to me what you are is God's gift to you, and what you become is your gift to God. And I just thought, "Oh my word." I mean, what he was saying is, don't do anything stupid, don't do anything cavalier, but if the way to be the most whole person you can be, the way to be a person who can love other people in the world and all of this, if the way to do that is you need to make a gender change, then actually that's what you might need to do. And the second thing was, I just really came to realize that if I'd had, let's say, a liver problem and I might die, or a heart problem, I wouldn't say, well, if God had wanted me to be well, God would have given me a good heart. I would go and get it fixed.
Hmm.
The thing about God being non binary, it's a couple of points. One is, just because we are sexed and gendered doesn't mean that God is. Whatever we say about God, language is completely failing us. Like I say, if I say God knows me or God loves me, what on earth does that really mean? We can't really fathom it. I think one of our problems with God is that the Bible tells us that God made us in God's image. But what human beings do is we flip that round and we make God in our own image. So for centuries, if you're a white, straight man, then God is a white, straight man. Jesus did call God our Father. I'm not querying that at all. But then he was using human language for humans in a human situation. Interestingly enough, though, our Bibles in the original Hebrew or the original Aramaic, there's lots of little indications of femininity in God. I think the fact that we say he and all of this kind of business, I think that's us limiting God. I think God has all the scopes. So God is beyond our understanding. It's lazy to think of some bloke in a cloud with a beard who incidentally is not disabled and does not have any inherent difficulties in one way or another with anything, perfect eyesight, square jaw, all of these things, I think, in a sense, small b, are blasphemy. I think we're getting it wrong. So we have to just say we have no idea. But I would say within the potentiality, God is neither male nor female, or both. So non-binary.
Such a powerful concept. Coming out stories from inspiring LGBTQ plus people today. Now, let's come back down to earth for a minute. You've been open about the fact that you were outed in the media. So the decision to come out was made for you, essentially, in 2005. This was just after you'd been ordained by the Church of England. Do you mind me asking what happened there and how it felt?
So I was ordained in 2004, and in the Anglican Church, you get ordained as a deacon 1 year, and then oftentimes the next year you're ordained priest. So I'd been ordained deacon, so I was working in a parish in a market town. Everybody knew me. I was really visible, been in services, etc. And we always knew that I could be outed. Anything to do with sex and vicars or sexuality and vicars, you're a bit of a target. And I was sitting at my desk one Friday afternoon and I got a phone call, a very nice phone call, but a phone call from a journalist saying he was working for a national newspaper. He had all my old details and he just said, is it true? And we'd always had this long-standing plan that because I'm not a professional in dealing with journalists, I simply refer him to the diocese to say, look, just speak to so and so. Anyway, this is what we did. But they wanted the story. It was one particular newspaper at the time. We had an interview, we gave them an exclusive interview, and they didn't publish for various reasons. And after 3 days of them not publishing, the diocese said to me that we couldn't live like that. I mean, basically every morning I would wake up, go down and buy this particular daily newspaper, look at it to see if I was outed in it, and then try and live my life. So in the end, we decided that we had to out me. So we sent the press release out on the wires, and then I had 3 days of the world's press kind of contacting me.
It must have been a heavy burden to shoulder in the early days.
Yeah, it was quite difficult because it was all kind of in crisis mode in the sense that your diary just gets completely taken over by this. And I'd made my gender change many years before. And so there were a lot of people who didn't know about my change, including some quite close friends. So I had to scoot around a whole bunch of people to tell them that they were about to see me in the newspaper. I interrupted some close friends actually eating their dinner. I knocked on the door and said, "Can I speak to you?" And they said, "Can you come back in an hour?" And I said, "I can't because I've got to be somewhere else to tell someone else." So while they ate their dinner, I sat down and told them, and it was like a bizarre situation. There was a lot of kind of, "I need to tell you something. I need to tell you something now." And in fairness, most of the people hearing it didn't need to hear it. And they wouldn't have wanted to hear it. Like, it's information that they would say, "Too much information." I mean, no one said that to me, but if you go to church, you might not wanna know about the most intimate details of your vicar. It's kinda like you go to church for a lot of reasons, not to think about somebody's medical history or their sexual preferences. It was a tricky time. When I got this last posting now that I'm in at the moment in St John's in central Cardiff, the diocese and the church were just great from the beginning. But they said to me, my first week, "Look, we probably need to do the story again." And I didn't honestly particularly want to because I'm already out. But their point, and they were correct, their point was, if we don't do a newspaper article and put it out there, somebody else will, and they might write it sloppily and get some of the facts wrong and all of this. So it's just far better, since we're not ashamed of anything, that we actually do a press release and do the story. And they're 100% right. But it's these little things that kind of, in one sense, it takes it out of you because you're giving and it's more vulnerable again. But do you know the good thing? The good thing is that every time I'm outed, And every time somebody says something to someone, or every time someone writes a blog post, it's almost certain that there is someone out there who says to themselves, "Oh my word, I'm not alone." Being visible is a bit costly, but also it really helps other people. What is interesting too is sometimes, particularly when I was outed in Ross, people sought me out for things nothing to do with sexuality and gender. I had several people come to me with problems such as gambling or addictions, and they said to me, "I'm coming to you because I saw you in the newspapers and I realized that you have been through a difficult time. I feel I can talk to you about my difficulty because I know that you have your gender change or what have you." So it was very interesting that actually it's not confined to LGBT matters. People, certainly they saw me as a priest as being more approachable because I'd had to deal with something big in my life.
And perhaps that level of empathy as well, that you understand the human struggle and different issues. How's the church reacted overall?
Church-going people have been really fine mostly. When I was outed, there was no one in the congregation who actively kind of sought me out and told me off or anything. I do think that there may have been a couple of people who were uncomfortable and maybe didn't agree with it and gracefully pulled away or maybe found another church to go to. I mean, there wasn't a mass exodus, but it was nicely handled in a sense. Most people are fine because they knew me. They knew me first. They knew who I was. The church has been both fine and not fine. I had great support when I was outed. The bishop was wonderful. He'd always said to me, "If you're ever outed, I will stand right by you because I'm backing you because I do not see this as a kind of problem." And he was as good as his word. But then senior leaders come, senior leaders go, management changes, and some of the later key players in parts of the church where I were liked me perfectly well, but actually it was pretty jolly obvious that they were not really looking at me as one of the key pillars of what they were wanting to build. I had one very senior person who I liked very much and who liked me just say to me, "Is it really surprising that some people don't want to consider you for the next post?" It's a kind of wake up moment, isn't it? That somewhere there in this really nice person who liked me, he was thinking, well, that there's, of course some people are going to be prejudiced. On the other hand, there were lots of really good senior leaders who were very supportive. The diocese here, when I applied for the job, could not have been better. They support me along the way. So it's kind of mixed and there's work to do. But on the whole, I've had a lot more good than bad. But there's definitely bits of the church where really, it's pretty obvious that they don't want a trans person around or anything.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that will come into them sort of not taking that time to read the scriptures and to explore how the faith works so well in tandem with everyone being different. And I suppose some people just haven't dedicated the time to that. What strikes me and what I hope listeners to the podcast take away from this is that there is so much positivity in the church towards LGBTQ plus people. And I think that's refreshing to hear, and it's really inspiring to hear from you within the church about how you've been welcomed and about your experience.
Yeah, thank you, and there genuinely is. I mean, you can tumble down to your local church, and if you're unlucky, people will, think badly of you, but not so far away will be a religious group that would welcome you with open arms. So it's getting a lot better, and there's a lot more welcome and positivity out there than people might think.
Yeah. Am I right in thinking around 2017, the bishop of the Anglican Church looked into welcoming transgender people specifically?
Yeah, the Church of England, You have to use certain services. You can write your own bits within certain guidelines or rules, but essentially you're not free to start with an absolute blank piece of paper. And the Church of England realised that there were trans people coming forward who were saying to them, look, I'd love to be welcomed in my new name, even if that new name was they'd made their change 20 years ago or 15 years ago. So the Church of England did repurpose an existing service. But having said they were going to do it, there was a conservative backlash. Lots of people wrote to the Church of England and says, this is terrible, you cannot do this. And in fact, they backtracked. So it never actually happened. So that for me was one of the first indications that there was an anti-trans backlash on the way.
It's such a shame. I feel like for every step forward, there are 3 steps back, which has been the case throughout LGBTQ plus history.
Yeah, it's true. And certainly, recently, let's say the gender critical movement has really pushed back against trans people a bit on different levels, and it's been a bit unexpected because when I made my gender change, I was just making a personal decision. This is not a movement. It's not a political ideology. It's not an anything. I was just saying, how do I live in the world without crumbling inside or living a lie? So I made my individual gender change based on how I was in the world. But it's sort of being portrayed now by various groups. Oh, there's a big movement, there's a trans ideology. And if you're a kind of tomboyish, potentially lesbian young girl, be careful because you're going to come into contact with this movement and it's going to try and convince you that you're really a boy because they're sort of just trying to grow the movement. But it isn't true. It just isn't true. Like any form of prejudice, it's just wrong as a prejudgment. I mean, you can say someone behaves badly if they behave badly, but don't take a characteristic like their race or their sexuality or their gender or anything about them and say, "Oh, well, you're from this country, you must be bad in this sort of way, or you're trans, you must be this." It's ridiculous.
Exactly, and it feels like once you take an issue or an experience and shed light on it, everyone's suddenly so worried about it. There's this magnifying glass, and I wonder if that's sort of what's happening, with politicizing the trans movement or politicizing any kind of trans identity at the moment. Perhaps as more people understand it and see it, and experience it, and more of us are speaking about it, there's gonna be those people that say, "Oh, it's suddenly taking over the world." Well, it's not. It's just, as you say, someone having their experience and going through the experience they need to go through.
Yeah, indeed. I remember when women were really not as visible in the workplace, certainly as managers. And I remember, in the 70s and 80s, because, oh, women are taking over now. It's all women this, it's all women that. And actually, nobody really says that now. We've just realized that all that's happening is the mix is getting slightly better and we've got a long way to go. So you're right. There's a kind of, because it's lit up in lights at the moment, sometimes people are worrying more about it than actually the reality warrants.
Exactly. And you mentioned this backlash, but what else has changed over the time that you've been out as trans? Have you felt a shift or a change in society?
I think there have been lots of positive changes. I mean, I made my gender change properly in 1991. And, you could turn on the television or the radio and you'd never hear a trans person on it. And now there are people in the media and we're a bit more visible and things. So that's kind of nice. And also, I think more people know someone who has questioned their gender or is somewhere on this kind of spectrum and not necessarily making a gender change, but is kind of being non-binary or is somewhere here, there, or what have you. And it's becoming more kind of normal because the world is still turning and people realize that they still love their colleague or their boss or their friend or their whatever. And not a lot has changed in so many ways, even though this person has changed a bit about them. So, yeah, there are some good things, I think. But imagine now you were in that place of having to think about, do you need to change your gender? Maybe you're 12 or you're 21 or you're 7 and you're just realizing, and you catch some anti-trans backlash or rhetoric. Oh my word, nobody needs that, in exactly the same way that gay men and lesbian women for years in the 50s and 60s caught this idea that society thought they were disgusting or perverted. How much harm can come to someone because their very core identity is overloaded with this, well, rubbish. It's dangerous. It's very dangerous.
It is dangerous, and I think in speaking about it, you attract that kind of criticism, feedback, horrible phobic comments. But then if we don't speak about it, we can't be the role models that help these people come out. So it becomes this battlefield, and I think it's a battlefield that social media has completely, what's the word? It was given a platform to these kind of battles, really, these battles of experience, which is negative. And
Yeah.
you know, you mentioned in the same Attitude interview that I've mentioned that it can just be exhausting to be a queer person in a straight person's world. That resonated. I think, you know, we're here on a podcast that's talking about coming out, but coming out is a bit exhausting. And with all the good that we can do, the bad comes with it. How do you keep your energy up? I know you do lots of public speaking, you do public engagements, and you inspire so many people. How do you keep that energy up?
Oh, that's nice of you to say, Rosie. I mean, sometimes doing good things in the speaking or something like the podcast here, actually that does give you a lift because you've done something. So I kind of like that. But there are days, even now, when I sometimes sit and cry. I'm just so tired and so exhausted and so fed up. And it's not like I'm depressed or there's a massive problem. It's just this sheer exhaustion all the time of carrying this extra kind of load. And I've just learned that if there are days like that, then you go with it because you're not making it up. It's just what happened. And then you get up and fight the next day. You just do it better. I do find that my faith keeps feeding me. And I do find that actually I'd rather do something about a problem than be crushed by it. So I love doing the speaking. I love finding funny ways to introduce things and make people kind of think, oh yeah, okay, I get that now. That for me is taking a bit more agency over what's happening.
What gives you hope for the future?
Well, do you know what? I actually think that the future is more accepting and more diverse. I think it is an argument we're going to win. We're not going to win every single day with every single person, but actually, ultimately, most people on the LGBTQIA spectrum are fine people, and people will realize that. And also, I am just a kind of hopeful person to be fair. I think part of faith is saying that there are terrible times, and actually ultimately we will tend towards salvation.
Such a positive note to end on.
One of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast is because I think Outcast is all the things that we've been talking about today. It's about being a positive influence. It's about being a little bit of light in potentially a little bit of a dark place. It's about supporting both the baby dykes and the people who've been doing it for years. It's about sharing humanity and good stories and all of this. So, I think Outcast is going to be part of the reason I have hope.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's honestly so incredible to hear your whole story directly. Thank you for listening to Outcast, a podcast with interviews and coming out stories from inspiring LGBTQ+ people. I'm your host, Rosie Pentreath. I hope you can join us again next week.